There is a photograph taken in Chicago in 1892 that I have been staring at for the better part of 6 months. It shows a building that no longer exists, a structure so large, so ornate, so implausibly finished for its supposed age, that every time I look at it, I feel the same low, persistent unease. The building is the administration building of the World's Columbian Exposition. It was built, according to every official record, in under 2 years. It was then demolished 4 years later, and the reason given for its demolition is the same reason given for hundreds of similar structures across this country during a very specific window of time, between roughly 1871 and 1935. It burned, or it was simply torn down, or it was repurposed and then quietly erased. I want to be careful here. I'm not going to tell you that someone planned this. I genuinely don't know enough to say that. What I can tell you is what the documents show, what the numbers reveal, and where the evidence still sits. In archives, in survey records, in the contradictions between what official history reports and what photographs from that period actually depict. Something happened to a significant portion of the built world during that window, and the explanation we have been given for what replaced it, a story of industrial progress, of new nations building themselves from scratch, of culture rushing forward into modernity, doesn't account for what we can still verify with our own eyes. The gap between the narrative and the physical record is wide enough that I can't look away from it anymore. Here is where I started. In 2019, I was researching municipal water infrastructure for an entirely different project, something mundane about pipe materials and city contracts in the Midwest. I kept encountering references to construction timelines that felt wrong. Not wrong in the way that old records are sometimes imprecise. Wrong in the way that a number in a ledger doesn't match the number in the invoice attached to it. I found a report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics published in 1897 that attempted to catalog the labor force required to complete large-scale civic construction projects in American cities between 1880 and 1895. The methodology was imperfect, but one line in that report stopped me cold. The report estimated that the cumulative square footage of public buildings completed in American cities with populations over 50,000 between 1880 and 1895 exceeded 340 million square feet. That number is large but not impossible. What made me pause was the supplementary note beneath it, a note that has been cited almost nowhere in the scholarship I can find. The supplementary note stated that the figure did not include structures already standing at the beginning of the study period that were attributed to construction activity from before 1865. Before 1865, in cities that, by every other historical record, were largely wilderness or frontier settlement before 1840. Before adequate manufacturing of structural steel. Before Portland cement was in widespread commercial use in North America. Before the railroad networks existed to deliver the volume of stone and lumber that those structures would have required. I don't know what to do with that note. I genuinely don't. But it sent me backward through a different set of records, and what I found there is what this investigation is actually about. Let me tell you about a man named Elias Holt. He was born in 1831, in a town called Millhaven, in the western reaches of what was then Upper Canada. His occupation, in every census record I can locate, is listed as surveyor. But the detail that makes him matter to this story is a set of field journals he kept between 1857 and 1873, now held in fragmentary form in the Ontario Provincial Archives in Toronto. In those journals, Holt documented what he found when he was sent to assess land tracts for potential settlement. He was meticulous in a way that most surveyors of his era were not. He recorded not just the measurements of a given parcel, but everything standing on it when he arrived. In an entry from September of 1861, Holt described arriving at a tract of land near the north shore of Lake Erie that had been designated as uninhabited wilderness on the official maps he was working from. What he found instead were the foundations of at least 11 structures. Not small structures, not trapper cabins or indigenous seasonal shelters. He described them as substantial masonry foundations of a kind indicating permanent use, with stone cut and fitted to a standard I have not observed in structures built locally within living memory. He measured them, he sketched them, and then he wrote something that I keep returning to. He wrote, "I am unable to determine by what hands or in what era these were erected, but I am certain they were not erected recently, and I cannot reconcile their presence with the maps I was given." He filed his oaths. survey with the Colonial Land Office. He included his sketches. The tract was subsequently recorded as undeveloped land suitable for settlement. His sketches do not appear in the filed copy. Only his acreage measurements remain. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming here. Field journals from mid-19th century surveyors are not infallible. Holt could have been exaggerating. He could have been looking at natural stone formations and interpreting them as architecture. People have done that, before and since. But his measurements are specific. He recorded foundation dimensions. He noted the orientation of the structures relative to solar east, which suggests deliberate construction rather than natural formation. And he was not the only surveyor who left records like this. Between 1850 and 1880, at least 14 other survey documents from across Canada, the American Midwest, and parts of the Argentine Pampas describe variations of the same encounter. A land assessor arrives at EEDO, territory designated as empty, and finds physical evidence of prior occupation that the official record cannot account for. I found these documents over the course of about 8 months of archival research. 7 of them are in publicly accessible collections. The Ontario records are at the Archives of Ontario, searchable by Fawn's reference. The American documents are distributed across 3 different state archive systems, which is part of why no one seems to have read them together. This is the part that I keep sitting with. These documents weren't hidden. They weren't classified. They were filed, cataloged, and left alone, because the information in them didn't fit a category anyone was looking for. The absence of evidence here is not the erasure of documents. It's the absence of anyone asking the right questions while reading the documents that survived. Now I need to show you the arithmetic that doesn't add up, because this is where the investigation shifts from subjective, a researcher who might be misreading old handwriting, to something more difficult to dismiss. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. You have almost certainly seen photographs of it. The White City. Those enormous, immaculately detailed neoclassical buildings reflected in lagoons, attended by millions of visitors over a 6-month period. The official construction timeline states that the principal buildings of the exposition were designed and built between 1890 and 1893. 14 major structures. The largest of them, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, covered more than 30 acres under a single roof. It was, at the time, the largest enclosed space in the history of the world. The construction budget for the entire exposition, as reported to Congress and documented in the records of the World's Columbian Exposition Company, was $18.26 million for all structures, grounds, and exhibits combined. 14 major buildings, 30-plus acres of enclosed space, 16 months of active construction, $18.26 million in 1893 dollars. I want you to hold that number. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina was constructed during the same period, between 1889 and 1895, a single private residence, 175,000 square feet. The documented construction cost was $5.3 million for one house. The Manufactures building alone contained more than 4 times the enclosed square footage of the Biltmore Estate. Its construction was reportedly completed in under a year. The math doesn't produce a plausible answer. Not in 1893, not with the construction technology that was available then, not at that price. I don't know what that gap means. I want to say that clearly. There are historians who have noted the anomalous speed of White City construction and attributed it to a uniquely concentrated national labor mobilization, to the fact that this was a project of American prestige and that resources were directed toward it in a way that defied normal economic logic. That explanation is possible. It may even be partially correct, but it doesn't account for the consistency of the pattern across other projects in other countries during the same period. In 1878, the Paris Exposition Universelle. In 1873, the Vienna World Exhibition. In 1862, the International Exhibition in London. All of them featuring structures of implausible scale built in implausible time at implausible cost. All of them demolished within a decade of completion. The demolition of the Chicago structures was blamed on a fire in the first winter after the exposition closed. The fire is documented. It was real, but it destroyed only some of the structures. The rest were dismantled, deliberately, systematically, between 1894 and 1896. Why demolish permanent quality buildings after 3 years of use? That is the question I cannot put down. If you've made it this far, you already know you're not the kind of person who accepts the first explanation given. There are more investigations, like this one, coming. And if you want to be there when they surface, subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss them. This channel exists for people who read the receipts. I spent a long time trying to find a conventional explanation for the demolition. The most common one I encountered is economic. The land was valuable, the maintenance costs were prohibitive, and the buildings served no purpose beyond the exposition itself. That explanation is reasonable. It might even be correct. But it doesn't reconcile with the documented appraisals of the structures themselves. A civil engineer named Frederick Baumann, who published a technical assessment of the White City buildings in 1894 in the journal Inland Architect, described the foundation work as of permanent character, far exceeding the requirements of temporary exhibition purposes. He noted that the concrete work in particular was of a type and quality that would normally be expected to last many generations. Baumann was not writing with any obvious agenda. He was writing as an engineer, documenting what he observed. His report is still accessible. Inland Architect ran from 1883 to 1908, and archived issues exist in the Chicago History Museum collections. There is a moment in every investigation where the researcher has to admit what the evidence cannot prove. I am at that moment now. I cannot prove that the structures at the World's Columbian Exposition were pre-existing buildings that were refaced and incorporated into the exhibition rather than built from scratch. I cannot prove that the foundations Elias Holt documented in 1861 represent the remnants of a prior civilization rather than anomalous natural formations or unreported early settlement. I cannot prove that the wave of demolitions and fires that swept through the inherited architectural fabric of North America and Europe between 1871 and 1935 was coordinated or intentional rather than the organic churn of an industrializing world discarding its physical past. I genuinely don't know. And I want to say that without the hedging that sometimes makes these admissions feel like false modesty. The evidence I've described is real. The gaps in the official record are real. The arithmetic that doesn't close is real. But the distance between these things are anomalous, and these things were deliberately concealed, is a distance I cannot bridge with what I currently have. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I can say is this. The pattern is too consistent to be random noise. Too many surveys, too many buildings, too many timelines that don't survive close arithmetic, too many demolitions of permanent quality structures attributed to accidents or economic necessity, and too many official records that, when you read them carefully rather than in summary, contain notes like the one in that 1897 Bureau of Labor Statistics report, notes that acknowledge the anomaly and then proceed as if it isn't there. There is a woman I want you to know about. Her name was Margaret Sofia Vukovic. She was born in 1863 in a small town in what is now Serbia, and she emigrated to the United States in 1884 at the age of 21. She settled in Chicago. She worked as a seamstress in a textile factory in the near West Side, and in 1893 she attended the World's Columbian Exposition 17 times. We know this because she kept a diary that her great-granddaughter donated to the Newberry Library in Chicago in 2003, where it has been cataloged but, as far as I can determine, never formally studied. Vukovic was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She had no architectural training, but her diary entries from her visits to the exposition have a quality of observation that I find striking. She describes the buildings with a precision that is different from the wonder you find in most contemporary accounts. She is not dazzled. She is puzzled. In an entry from July of 1893, she writes, and I am paraphrasing because the diary is not publicly digitized. She writes something to the effect that the buildings reminded her of something she had seen at home, in the town where she grew up, and that she could not understand how the Americans had built these things so quickly when the similar things in her own country had been there, in a state of partial ruin, for as long as anyone could remember. She is describing a recognition. She is an immigrant from Central Europe looking at buildings in Chicago in 1893 and recognizing in them something familiar, something old, something that, in her experience, predated the civilization she was standing in. I cannot verify what she saw in Serbia. The village she came from no longer exists under that name. It was absorbed into a larger municipality sometime in the early 20th century, and its records are incomplete. I cannot find photographs. I cannot confirm that what she was comparing the Chicago buildings to was what I think she was comparing them to. But she wrote it down in a small cloth-bound diary that sat in a family's possession for more than a century before it found its way to a library shelf in Chicago. She wrote it down because it seemed important enough to record, and because she had no reason to lie, and because she was a 29-year-old woman standing inside one of the strangest buildings the modern world had ever seen and thinking, I have seen something like this before, in ruins, and no one knows. Who built it? I want to know something. Have you ever been in an old public building, a courthouse, a post office, a library built before 1910, and noticed something about its proportions, its ceiling heights, the dimensions of its doorways, that felt slightly wrong for a human being of normal size? Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off, the kind of off that you feel before you think it. I've been in 34 buildings I would describe this way, in 7 countries, and I have never been able to fully explain the feeling. Tell me in the comments where you were. Tell me specifically, the city, the building, what you noticed. I read every one, and I think the geography of those answers is going to tell me something I haven't been able to find in any archive. The story we were given about the 19th century is a story of building, of raw land becoming cities, of immigrant labor and industrial capital combining to produce, in a matter of decades, one of the most dense and architecturally ambitious built environments the world had ever seen. And parts of that story are true. The labor was real, the capital was real, the ambition was real, but the buildings were already there, or some of them were, or something was. The foundations that Elias Holt measured in 1861 on land that had never been officially settled. The permanent quality concrete that Frederick Baumann documented in 1894 under exhibition buildings that were then demolished within 2 years of his report. The diary entry of a Serbian seamstress who looked at the White City and recognized something that, in her homeland, had been ruined for longer than living memory. The century we call the 1800s, the century of building, of progress, of nations constructing themselves out of wilderness, may have also been a century of something else entirely, a century of inheriting, of finding, of dressing old bones in new clothes and calling the result a beginning. I don't know what happened in the decades before the records begin to cohere. I don't know what was here before the surveys designated it empty, and I am increasingly convinced that the people who conducted those surveys, at least some of them, at least Elias Holt in September of 1861, didn't know either. He measured the foundations, he made his sketches, and then someone, somewhere in the chain between his field journal and the official record, removed the sketches and recorded the land as empty. The land office file is still in Toronto. The measurements are still there. The reference to the sketches is still there in Holt's own hand, noting their attachment. The sketches themselves are not. Somewhere in those archives, in Toronto, in Chicago, in the stacks of the Newberry Library where Margaret Vukovic's diary sits catalogued and unstudied, the shape of what actually happened is still waiting to be read. It has been waiting for over a century. Subscribe because the next investigation gets closer to it than this. One did. The last Americans who remembered the White City standing are gone. The last Canadians who might have walked those Lake Erie foundations are gone. What remains is paper, measurements in old handwriting, a diary from a woman who recognized something she shouldn't have been able to recognize, and somewhere, in a land office file in Ontario, a space where a set of architectural sketches used to be. That space, that absence in a folder that otherwise remains intact, is the most precise thing I have found in 6 months of looking. Not a document, not a revelation, just a gap where something used to be, and the faint outline of what it was.